Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for those who have commented this morning about whether you've worked with law enforcement or presented cases to law enforcement or both or even none. I am excited to share this topic with you today, so we're just going to jump right in. I will say that there's a few of the things I'm going to reference today that if you don't understand them, go back and watch the webinars from the last 3 weeks, because all 3 of those weeks just lend beautifully to putting it all together for law enforcement in this presentation. So feel free to check those out on our YouTube channel. It's Workman Forensics, and I'm excited to have you today. So today's topic is presenting fraud findings to law enforcement. And so what we're going to focus on today are presenting findings to law enforcement that are related to employee theft or occupational fraud. There's a lot of different things we could report to law enforcement, but today that's going to be our focus because we only have 30 minutes. And as I started putting this presentation together, I realized I actually have a lot to say on this topic. And so I'm going to get through this in 30 minutes. If you have a question, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And then at the end, I'll address those questions. The last few weeks, I've addressed those questions at 11. So if you have to jump off, you'll get a copy of this recording afterwards when I answer those questions. But let's get started. So today we're going to talk about, once again, focusing on employee theft and occupational fraud. We're going to talk about coaching clients on case expectations. There is just a lot of different perceptions about what law enforcement does on these cases, especially because of, I call it like the CSI effect. So we have just setting the client expectations so that you and the client can win. Also, we're going to talk about law enforcement's goals and objectives. As a business owner and one of the things that I learned in school about marketing and what I found to be true in my business is that if you're going to reach a certain group of people, you need to know what their goals and objectives are. And so we're going to do the exact same thing here with law enforcement. We need to understand what their goals and objectives are so that we can set our report up, our communications, our findings, and ultimately our client and our client's case up for success. Then I'm going to just show you some things that I have learned over the last however many years about organizing and presenting to law enforcement. So let's get started. First of all, you may be wondering, okay, why should I listen to you about how to present cases to law enforcement? Well, just so you know, if you haven't listened to any of our podcasts or anything like that, my very, very, very first job was with the FBI. And this was right out of college and starting grad school. And I worked under a forensic accountant. And so I worked on countless cases for 2 years. I had a 2-year student position, top secret clearance, the whole thing. I was an employee, part-time employee. I testified before grand jury. I wrote reports. It was the most amazing experience of my life. Then I worked in public accounting, and then I started Workman Forensics almost 10 years ago. It'll be 10 years this November. So I worked for them. And then after I left the FBI and went into public accounting, I had an opportunity to contract with the IRS Criminal Investigative Division. And so I worked with them. It was pretty simple. I did a lot of data entry, but I worked on cases involving like money laundering and structuring. Then in starting Workman Forensics, I had never worked with local law enforcement. And this may be something you want to check into with your local police department, but the Tulsa Police Department has a financial crimes unit. And the financial crimes unit and the Tulsa Police Department actually has a volunteer program. And so I was able to volunteer with the Tulsa Police Department to kind of see how do they work these cases. And I actually worked a couple of embezzlements with them. And then also just learned about different other crimes that I had never investigated before by volunteering with them. So I have a very, and while I was volunteering with them, I would ask them questions about, okay, what is your process and where does this go after you? How does the assistant district attorney want to see these things, so that I could understand what does law enforcement need. So today I'm going to share with you those things that I have found in my experience. Once again, this is just based on my experience. So if you've had a different experience, I can't speak for that, but in the Northern District of Oklahoma, federally, or Tulsa County, OSBI, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, this is how these things work. All right, so on coaching client expectations, we need them to understand what fraud is. And fraud is someone receiving benefit with some sort of intentional deceit. So we need a client to understand that if they think someone is intentionally trying to harm them, but there is no benefit, we're probably not going to be able to present their case to law enforcement. And also, and this is usually for the attorney to weigh in on too, if there's any type of civil action. But we need to have both to have a really strong case for law enforcement. And so that's where I always try to push it in the middle of the client drama and the story that they're telling me. Where was the intentional deceit? Why do you think they did this? Why is this wrong? And then how did this person benefit? How did it make their life unfairly better? But you've got to be able to quantify that. Those are kind of terrible words, but you've got to be able to quantify that benefit. Then the client also needs to know what are the venues for recovery or punishment or for the subject. And so the three that I always talk to my clients about are insurance claims, civil lawsuits, and criminal reporting. So I'm going to just kind of go through these briefly. Insurance. A lot of times, and this is one of the first questions, a lot of small businesses don't have employee theft coverage, as a separate policy, but their general liability will cover, the most common I've seen is $25,000. So you want to always ask them, does your general liability insurance policy cover employee theft? If so, that's going to help cover your fees and the attorney's fees. It'll just kind of help, sometimes it feels like adding insult to injury. So by asking that question, that kind of gives them some additional, funds to work through this process. So they're going to submit a claim. You're going to, I always prepare a report that we're going to go over today, but I'm going to prepare a report and then I'm going to report that give that to the insurance company. And then the insurance company, a lot of times, especially if the loss is fairly large, they're going to send that to a forensic accountant that they contract with to review the work. Something that clients need to know is that if you're going to file an insurance claim, the insurance company will require you to prosecute because they need a way to recover those funds later. So you're going to recover sooner. They want to be in line to receive any restitution or things like that. So you have to prosecute. And I was, when I volunteered with TPD, I actually asked about this. And insurance companies will actually call Tulsa police and ask if a police report has been filed. So they do follow up on these things. So, and then I'll just also add, a lot of times, and we're going to talk about this today, a lot of my clients end up, because of the dollar amount, we end up having a federal case. And so the insurance company will say, where's your police report? Whenever you file to federal law enforcement, there's not really a police report to be able to provide them. So we usually just communicate that this has been handed over to so-and-so at the IRS criminal division or the FBI or whatever, and that usually works. All right, so then another option is a civil lawsuit. Civil lawsuit, I recommend this when we think that a client or that a subject has purchased assets that we might want to go after, or if they have money, or if they have, maybe we think that their family has an ability to pay and help them work through this. If we're wanting to settle, if trying to maximize our collection is important and feasible, then a civil route is a great way to go. And definitely an attorney obviously needs to be involved, but there are going to be attorney's fees. There's going to be fees for me as an expert. But the nice thing about a civil lawsuit is that it provides an avenue for discovery, which includes your subpoenas. And that gives you a lot more information that helps you take your case further, that actually helps in giving that case to law enforcement, because you can get so much more information. If someone's stolen from the company, we're limited to what the company has until they file that civil lawsuit and start getting some of that discovery in, where we can see the subject's bank accounts, the subject's credit card statements, and things like that. The burden of proof for a civil lawsuit is also lower than a criminal case. And also a civil lawsuit allows you, often, depending on different rules and what is being alleged and all of that, you can also quantify damages like interest. But for this theft, we would have done X or Y. And so being able to quantify that. Then you can also file a judgment, and judgments can kind of be expensive too because you have to renew them every so often, but still it's another area of collection and recourse for your client. Then we have the criminal piece, and that's where we're going to hang out here today. Criminal piece, just in case you've never gone through this process before, is we have an investigator, some sort of investigative agency, whether that's the police department or an FBI agent, an OSBI detective. We've got an investigator. Then we have a prosecutor. Then we can also have some money judgments involved. We can have restitution. We can have asset forfeiture. So these are some different ways that through the criminal process, the client can feel a sense of justice. However, we're going to talk about how we've got to set those expectations, though, because a lot of times the client, I really want to be delicate about how I say this, but sometimes the client is just very disappointed because they're not educated on what a reasonable expectation of maybe a sentencing or an arrest. So, and then also the time involved for law enforcement to work a case. So because of the way we structure our cases, we can typically work a fraud an investigation in about 3 to 6 months. I mean, 6 months is like taking a really long time for us, but in about 3 to 6 months, we can work a multi-million-dollar embezzlement case. So we provide this work product to the client very quickly, right? Then we send that to law enforcement, and most of my cases resolve in a year, but I can't say that for every case of mine, and I can't say that for every investigator. So I like to set the client's expectations that yes, we're going to work on this and you're going to get results from us in a very timely fashion. But you've got to realize that there are only so many prosecutors, only so many investigators. And so they're working within their resources and their time. And so it just may take a little bit. But I do believe that if you provide them with information like what we're going to talk about in a few slides, then that does speed up that time involved that they have to spend on your case. I like to set the expectation that arrest and sentencing and restitution for a white-collar crime is often very anticlimactic when your only exposure to this has been watching TV. So none of my clients have ever been arrested, or none of my clients or the subjects of my client investigations have ever been arrested. They have cooperated, and there has been an information filed, or they've been interviewed by the police department and they come to some sort of agreement and then they plea. So the whole like showing up at their house or work and dragging them out, I don't believe that has ever happened in all the embezzlement cases that I've worked at Workman. Sentencing is often another area where clients are just like, really? That's all it is? Because it feels so big to them. But the maximum sentence that any of my clients have ever, or the subjects of my client investigations have ever received is about 3 to 5 years. So, and most of them are 3 years. So I like to set that expectation, and that was for over $3 million. The other thing is that restitution, what the clients have to understand is that the individuals have to pay restitution based on, and there's a formula, but it's based on their essentially earnings. And so since they've lost their job, they have lost, they've already spent this huge sum of money. The restitution is often something like $100 to $300 a month. That's been my experience. And so you want your client to understand that law enforcement is not a collection agency. And I put the posters of McMillions and Bad Education both on HBO on this slide because I just wanted to mention that in McMillions, there was $24 million stolen, and most participants received house arrest or probation. And the main kind of kingpin of all of this, he cooperated, and so he received 3 years in prison, and he pays about $350 a month. That's his restitution. So just to put that in perspective, kind of similar situation in Bad Education. So just something to keep in mind. Also, if you haven't watched those, they're really interesting. All right, so let's understand law enforcement's goals and objectives. First of all, we have our federal versus state law enforcement. Of course, this is in the United States, and I know we have people joining us from all over. So the FBI investigates all kinds of fraud cases. The IRS Criminal Division primarily investigates tax fraud, also money laundering, like I mentioned earlier. Secret Service, a lot of times people don't know this, but Secret Service actually investigates financial crimes. They were originally set up to investigate counterfeiting, and now they work all kinds of white-collar crimes. Postal Inspector is also another area to work some of these financial crimes, especially if it involves the mail, then they can investigate mail fraud. Then in the state, we have our local police. In Tulsa, we actually have a financial crimes unit. We have our sheriff's office, and some, if it happens in the county and outside of the city, sometimes the sheriff's office will work fraud cases. We have in Oklahoma, we have our state law enforcement, which is our investigative unit, which is our Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, and they have detectives that will work on fraud investigations. And then I also just mentioned our state auditor, because even though they're not actually law enforcement, they do work investigation. They have a special investigative division that works, they'll do investigations within like cities or municipalities and schools, any public entity, they'll look into that. And then they'll make a reference to the OSBI and the Attorney General's office. All right, so we have to understand crimes related to occupational fraud so that we can know what are the elements that law enforcement is looking for. So on the federal side, which most of my cases, we look for a federal nexus, I guess, of to see, is there a way that the crimes that have been committed, especially if it's a large dollar amount, are any of these crimes that could be federal crimes present in the evidence that we have? Because our states are overwhelmed. They don't have all the resources for nonviolent criminal investigations. And so because of that, a lot of times the state charges actually get pled down to misdemeanors. And if you've done this for any period of time, it is very frustrating for a client who's hired someone only to find out that they've stolen previously, but either it wasn't prosecuted, it was pled down to a misdemeanor, those types of things. So that's why we try to look for what are some federal crimes that were committed. So we have bank fraud, which is using the bank in any sort of facilitation of the crime. Wire fraud, so were wires used in the facilitation of these crimes. And we also look for interstate commerce when we're looking for this as well. So if I had someone who stole money through payroll and she was using QuickBooks to facilitate it, but the way that the money worked, her bank was, I believe, Chase, and she was in Oklahoma, and then where it was actually being sent via wire was in another state. So we had interstate commerce, which allowed that to be a federal case. Then also if somebody uses the mail to facilitate their crime. And then also we have tax fraud, and that's probably the most common charge that we get on our cases, is when just somebody didn't report their stolen money as income. And it's like the Al Capone. A lot of people reference Al Capone when they're talking about these charges. So a lot of times our cases are worked by FBI and IRS Criminal Division so that we can use several of these crimes. Also, another thing I want to point out is that state crimes, that embezzlement is actually a state crime. So a lot of times people say, I want you to get this charged federally for embezzlement. That's not a thing. So embezzlement is actually a state crime. Fraud is a state crime. Then we also have things that are add-ons to these crimes, which include money laundering and identity theft, which enhance the sentencing for these different crimes. Okay, this is one of my favorite things or one of the things I have to tell people, is that embezzlement is not a crime when money is missing from a partner in a business or in a divorce. It is not a thing. Embezzlement involves theft by someone who was entrusted with another's property. So you cannot, if I own something, I cannot embezzle my own property. Okay, so a lot of times when we get partnership disputes or divorce cases, they'll say, I want them to be charged for embezzlement. You can't do that when the person is an owner. So I like to set client expectations from the beginning. You do not have a criminal case here. You have a civil case, or maybe sometimes there is a criminal case, but most of the time, if it's related to stealing money, law enforcement will not work it because that person owned that money and could decide where that money went. All right, when we are preparing information for law enforcement, we want to make sure that we do not give them boxes and boxes and boxes of evidence. You have to keep in mind that these are, I'm sorry, I've got to pause for a second. Kelly is correct. No one steals to pay taxes except Nathan Mueller, and that is correct. Okay, I gotta go. So we don't want to give law enforcement boxes and boxes of evidence because they don't have time to go through those boxes of evidence. Plus, that's what we were hired for. So what we want to provide instead is to just focus on the facts. And we want to focus on cash, not accounting methods. Think about this. Law enforcement needs this case to either, they've got two options. The person's going to plead guilty. So it's going to be so simple, so straightforward that this person can plead guilty to what has been alleged and what the evidence is supporting. Or law enforcement is going to have to take this case to trial and convince a jury of the evidence, show them the evidence, and convince them beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest burden of proof. So that's why we can't get bogged down in the accounting details and, oh my goodness, they classified this expense as an asset. Sometimes that is helpful, but what we have to start with is where did the cash go? So we need to look at where did money come from and where did it go? So once again, we have to have intent and we have to have benefit. So I can't read the mind of the subject, right? But what I can do is identify evidence, and we talked about this especially last week, I think, but identify evidence that supports that they were intentionally deceiving the victim. And then we have to show where that individual benefited. Help the investigator make those connections. And what I also like to do is make sure that I have shown them this is where the money came from, this is where the money went, and sometimes I'm stuck. Sometimes as a private investigator or forensic accountant, I am stuck where I can't see their bank accounts, especially if we don't have a civil lawsuit. So I want to take that information as far as I can so that when I give them this information, they can say, oh, we'll just go look at their bank accounts and see if this showed up there. That's the point where we want to take this. If we have a civil lawsuit, my team, we go ahead and we take it all the way. Look, this is where that money ended up. These are the assets they purchased with this money, and then we let law enforcement do their job. And I'm not suggesting that we are somehow like consultants for law. Look, we need to understand these things so that we can better do our jobs as fact finders. We also need to communicate to law enforcement, why is this benefit not okay? Why is it not okay that the subject received this money? So a lot of times what we're wanting to show, and I'm going to go back, I'm going to reference these Venn diagrams again. We're going to compare what happened to what should have happened. Here, the what happened is this individual received $200,000. What should have happened? The employment agreement says she should have only received $100,000. And then our difference, what doesn't match, is our part that we're saying this is why this is not okay. One of the ways that we simplify our cases at Workman is we use something called a case planning worksheet. And actually, I'm going to make this bigger so you can see this. We use something called a case planning worksheet. And I've simplified this because this is actually part of our Be a Data Sleuth training. We do some activities using this. And I think that simplifying an investigation to present to law enforcement starts at planning. So when we get a case from a client, we ask them, what are your concerns? What are the things that you think happened? Why is this not okay? And so we list those concerns in that first column. We usually have some follow-up questions once we sit down to do this planning. But then we talk about what analysis is going to have to happen in order for us to verify or kind of just determine or audit if these allegations are actually supported by evidence. So we talk about that analysis. Maybe it is comparing the payroll exports to the employment agreement. Maybe we'll just go with that example. So the information that we need is the employment agreement, and we also need the payroll exports. And so we start making a list of all the data and information that we need. What's nice about this is that we've already started to group what will be our findings in these categories. And it not only satisfies the client's concerns, so from a client service standpoint, we're serving the clients well and articulating to them, but also when it's time for the insurance report and the civil report and the criminal report, it's already organized in a fashion that every ultimate audience can understand. You can use one report for all three audiences. There are a few differences. Insurance, if you can show where the money came from, where it went, and why this is not okay. I have never had an insurance claim denied. If you can make it that simple and group it where it's organized, and we'll look at a couple options of that. Then if you're working a civil case, same thing. A civil case, though, might include a section where you calculated damages, but it will still, it's essentially the same thing. Where did money come from? Where did it go? Who benefited? What evidence do you have of intent? And criminal, same thing we've been talking about. So you can use one report for all three audiences, not to mention adding your client on top of that. All right, let's look at an example. A few things I'm going to point out before we look at this example. Less is more. I don't need to tell everyone all the hundreds of steps we went through to get the results we have. We need to just state our findings. How do we know what we know? I try to stay away from opinions unless that's part of something I've been hired to do. But especially when it comes to law enforcement, just state the facts like we talked about. We're going to group our findings by method, transaction type, concern, scheme, and don't be afraid to use bullet points. If I want to be able to look at a report and digest that information in a very quick and efficient manner. There's a marketing expert that I like to listen to, and he talks about how whenever people go to your website, they need to be able, if they feel overwhelmed and they're going to have to consume, use a lot of calories and energy to digest your information, then they're going to click away and go find something else. I think the same is true in presenting to any audience in a case. We want this to be clear, concise. You want enough evidence, but you don't want it to be overwhelming, and it needs to be organized. I've pulled out a copy of a report, and I actually downloaded this from the internet. It was a report that was published in our local newspaper about a case, but I've redacted the names, but I wanted it to be the public version of this report. So this is kind of old. We've changed things up just a little bit about how we do these reports, but we usually start out our reports with some sort of background, and this is where we're going to communicate what happened, what should have happened, what are the policies or standards. This individual, she asked the subject for the debit card, and he pulled the debit card out of his wallet. This was a case where this fire chief was using the fire department's debit card for personal expenses. And then she also advised that fire chief was the only one that accessed QuickBooks. So we like to put those things, what happened, what should have happened, some of that intent piece in there. Then we like to categorize by transaction type. So this one involved a debit card. So we had some ATM cash withdrawals, and then we also had just debit card usage, just using at different stores. So we grouped that. One of the things I pointed out as part of our intent, and just, and also to lend towards who benefited from this, was these ATM cash withdrawals. If I take cash out of an ATM, I didn't necessarily use it at someone's, at Apple Market or Office Depot and all these things that were listed. I just got cash. Well, there were no receipts for any of these expenditures, and he had coded them all in QuickBooks as if he had, but there was no change anywhere. And we all know that if you take out $300 from the ATM there and use it at, $200 at Office Depot, it's not going to be an even $200 normally. So there was no deposits offsetting this. The other thing is that then we grouped it by debit card expenditures. and we had debit card expenditures with supporting documentation and without supporting documentation. And then we also had other expenditures. Sometimes you just have some strange things that you think are important that contribute to the loss, and I just put those in another section. And then at the end, I like to tell law enforcement, this is what we believe the loss is, in just a nice table or an exhibit, which, just as a side note, we actually don't call our exhibits because that gets confusing when you go testify. So we actually call them attachments. So we have tables and attachments. In this report, this is an older report, so we called it potential loss exposure. We now talk about who benefited, the organization or the individual who was controlling everything. And then this is usually what our exhibits, or back in the day we called it exhibits, but our attachments look like. And what I wanted to show were these individual cash withdrawals and then how they were coded in QuickBooks. And then we went ahead and we called some of these different places to get additional information to quantify our loss. And then, although I know that there are a few people that think because we use so much data that we don't put together timelines or charts. And so I wanted to show this example of another effective way to communicate. Don't be afraid to use pictures. Then we usually provide supporting charts or Excel spreadsheets to support this information. Obviously, we create attachments to support it. But in this case, we had so many bank accounts. I don't even know how many. We had so many bank accounts. And so we used each, and we grouped the bank accounts, and then we showed the significant transactions on a timeline, but also a flow chart so that you could see how these things connect. Well, thank you all so much for joining me. This is the last webinar of this series because I think we're going to go through another little life change over the next week, just figuring out how to go back to work. But I'll let you know if we do another series. And thank you so much for joining me.